On November 25, 1177, a dying 16-year-old boy with bandaged hands and rotting flesh led 500 knights against 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By sunset, Saladin's unstoppable army lay shattered across the Palestinian hills, and the leper king had carved his name into legend with a sword he could barely feel. Think about those numbers for a second. 500 against 26,000. That's a 52-to-1 disadvantage. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land hung by a thread so thin it was invisible. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Baldwin IV achieved what every military historian calls impossible. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will blow your mind. First, the desperate gamble Baldwin made that violated every rule of medieval warfare. Second, why Saladin's elite Mamluk bodyguard abandoned their sultan and fled on camels. And third, the tactical innovation that turned 500 knights into an unstoppable killing machine. But here's what makes this truly insane. How did a teenager with advanced leprosy even stay in the saddle during a cavalry charge? Why did Saladin divide his army at the worst possible moment? How did the Crusaders cover 70 miles in 48 hours when medieval armies moved at walking speed? What psychological weapon did Baldwin deploy that broke Muslim morale before the battle even started? To understand how 500 men destroyed an empire's might, we need to go back to when Jerusalem itself was counting down to annihilation. January 1174. Jerusalem's royal palace. A 13-year-old boy stood before his horrified court and removed the silk gloves hiding his hands. The flesh was discolored, ulcerated, and in places, bone showed through. He'd been diagnosed with leprosy at age 9, and now, crowned king 3 months earlier, Baldwin IV faced a death sentence that came with a crown. Medieval leprosy wasn't just a disease, it was a curse, a divine punishment that rotted you alive while your mind stayed perfectly clear to watch your own decomposition. But Baldwin had something his physicians couldn't explain. An iron will that refused to accept the inevitable, and a tactical mind that would prove sharper than any sword in Christendom. Here's what makes Baldwin's situation genuinely insane. Medieval leprosy, Hansen's disease, attacks the peripheral nervous system first. You lose sensation in your extremities. Cuts, burns, infections go unnoticed until it's too late. Then the bacteria eats away at cartilage and bone. Fingers shorten. Facial features collapse. The disease progresses in stages, and by 1174, Baldwin was entering stage 3. Visible deformities, open lesions, partial paralysis. Medieval physicians gave him 2 years to live, maybe 3 if God was merciful. Think about that for a second. A 13-year-old boy watching his own body rot, knowing exactly how it ends. And he's supposed to rule a kingdom surrounded by enemies who outnumber his armies 20-to-1. But here's where Baldwin defied every expectation. While his body decayed, his mind sharpened. His tutor, William of Tyre, one of the era's great scholars, had educated Baldwin alongside noble sons in military history, tactics, Latin, Greek, and the chronicles of ancient commanders. William wrote years later with barely concealed awe. The boy absorbed lessons like desert sand absorbs water. He could recite Caesar's Gallic campaigns from memory. He understood Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae better than knights twice his age. Baldwin couldn't feel a sword in his hand, but he could visualize a battlefield like a chess master sees the board 10 moves ahead. The political situation was a nightmare. Jerusalem's nobility saw a dying child on the throne and started circling like vultures. Count Raymond III of Tripoli, the kingdom's most powerful baron, began maneuvering to become regent, essentially king in all but name. Guy de Lusignan, an ambitious French nobleman who'd recently arrived, married Baldwin's sister Sibylla, and positioned himself as heir. These men looked at the leper boy and saw opportunity. They expected Baldwin to die quickly and quietly, leaving them to carve up the kingdom. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 6 months of his coronation, Baldwin proved he understood power in ways that terrified his nobles. He played Raymond against Guy, using their rivalry to keep both off balance. He promoted loyal commanders regardless of their noble status, a radical move in feudal society. He personally reviewed garrison reports from every castle in the kingdom, memorizing troop strengths, supply levels, and commander capabilities. His nobles came to realize something horrifying. The dying boy was smarter than all of them combined, and he was absolutely ruthless about defending his authority. But Baldwin faced a threat no political maneuvering could stop. 600 miles south, in Cairo, a Kurdish general named Saladin was building an army specifically designed to retake Jerusalem. And Saladin had something Baldwin didn't: time. The Sultan could wait. He could build. He could prepare. Every month that passed, Saladin grew stronger, while Baldwin's body deteriorated further. By November 1177, Baldwin's physicians were begging him to abdicate, to retire to a monastery, to spend his final months in peace. The leprosy had spread to his face. He wore a silver mask in public to hide the lesions. He could barely walk. His hands were so damaged, he needed servants to feed him. And that's when Saladin invaded with 26,000 men. The dying boy would have to become a warrior. While Baldwin's body decayed in Jerusalem, 600 miles south in Cairo, a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub was building an empire. By 1174, Saladin had done what no Muslim leader had accomplished in 80 years. He'd unified Egypt and Syria under a single command, forging a war machine specifically designed to retake Jerusalem. His army wasn't a ragtag coalition. It was a professional force of 30,000 men, including 12,000 Turkish cavalry archers, 8,000 elite Mamluks, and mobile siege engines that could reduce Crusader fortresses to rubble. European chroniclers called him the new scourge of Christendom. Muslim poets called him the sword of Allah. Saladin called himself practical. Jerusalem was Islam's third holiest city, and 88 years under Christian occupation was 88 years too long. Here's what the European chronicles tried to hide. Saladin was a military genius who'd studied Crusader tactics for 20 years and designed his entire army to counter them. He'd fought as a young officer in Egypt, watched Frankish knights charge, seen how their heavy cavalry could shatter Muslim infantry like a hammer through glass. So he built an army that simply refused to fight that kind of battle. Turkish horse archers, 12,000 of them, trained from childhood to fire composite bows from horseback at full gallop. They could put an arrow through chainmail at 100 yards, loose 12 arrows per minute, and retreat faster than Crusader knights could pursue. Think about the tactical nightmare this created. European heavy cavalry was unstoppable in the charge, but Turkish archers never let them charge. They'd pepper the Christians with arrows from distance, fall back when the knights advanced, then wheel around and attack from behind. But Saladin's real innovation was the Mamluks. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were slave warriors, purchased as boys from the Turkish steppes and Caucasus Mountains, taken to Cairo at age 8 or 10, and subjected to a training regimen that would break modern special forces. For 8 years, they learned nothing but war. Horsemanship until they could shoot backwards at full gallop. Sword work until they could fight for hours without tiring. Unit tactics until they moved as one organism. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to own property, forbidden any loyalty except to their sultan. By age 18, they were the deadliest cavalry in the world. Saladin had 8,000 of them. The numbers defied belief. Crusader intelligence estimated Saladin's total military strength at 35,000 professional troops, not counting auxiliaries and siege specialists. The entire Kingdom of Jerusalem could muster maybe 2,000 knights and 10,000 infantry, and that was scraping the bottom of every castle and garrison in the realm. Saladin outnumbered the Christians 3-1 in total forces. But here's what made it worse. His troops were concentrated in 2 locations, Egypt and Damascus, while Crusader forces were scattered across 24 fortresses spread over 100 miles of coastline. Anytime Saladin chose to strike, he could bring overwhelming force against isolated positions. Between 1174 and 1177, Saladin systematically tested Crusader defenses. Small raids, probing attacks, siege attempts that withdrew before the Christians could concentrate forces. He was learning. Every skirmish taught him response times, garrison strengths, supply routes. European knights thought he was being cautious. Actually, he was being methodical, building a database of intelligence that would let him strike with surgical precision when the moment came. That moment was approaching. By October 1177, Saladin's spies reported that Baldwin, the leper boy king, was growing weaker by the month. The kingdom's nobility was fracturing into rival factions. The Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders who provided the kingdom's professional backbone, were feuding over castles and resources. Jerusalem looked ripe for conquest. Saladin assembled his invasion force in September 1177. 26,000 men, his largest army yet, including 3,000 Mamluks from his personal guard. The target was Ascalon, the coastal fortress blocking his land route between Egypt and Syria. Take Ascalon, and he could move armies freely, destroy its garrison, and Jerusalem would stand alone, isolated, surrounded. On October 18, 1177, Saladin's army crossed into Crusader territory. The Sultan was confident, patient, and certain of victory. He had every advantage: numbers, training, logistics, time. The leper boy in Jerusalem had none of those things. But Baldwin had something Saladin didn't expect: a willingness to gamble everything on a single, desperate throw of the dice. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 was a demographic nightmare wrapped in stone fortifications. 600,000 Muslims surrounded 120,000 Christians in a narrow coastal strip barely 100 miles long. The Crusader military consisted of roughly 2,000 knights and 10,000 infantry spread across 24 castles, constantly outnumbered, constantly one defeat away from total collapse. King Baldwin commanded maybe 600 knights in Jerusalem itself, and half of them were too old, too wounded, or too sick to fight. The kingdom's survival strategy was simple: hide behind massive walls, avoid open battles, and pray that Muslim infighting kept Saladin distracted. That strategy was about to fail catastrophically. Let that demographic reality sink in. 600,000 to 120,000. That's a 5-to-1 population disadvantage before you even start counting soldiers. The entire Christian population of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, men, women, children, elderly, could fit inside a modern sports stadium. They were outnumbered by people who wanted them dead or driven into the sea. Every military decision had to account for one brutal fact: lose too many men in any single battle, and there was no replacement pool. A Muslim army could lose 5,000 troops and recruit more from Egypt, Syria, or Iraq within months. The Crusaders lost 500 knights, and the kingdom might never recover. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how the kingdom survived this long. It wasn't divine providence or superior European fighting spirit. It was castle architecture and Muslim disunity. The Crusaders had built 24 major fortifications across their territory, each one a miniature city designed to withstand months of siege. Carac, Montreal, Belvoir, Beaufort. These weren't medieval castles in the storybook sense. They were military engineering marvels. Walls 15 feet thick, multiple layers of defense, cisterns that could hold water for a year, granaries stockpiled with enough food to outlast any siege. A Muslim army could besiege one castle for 6 months and accomplish nothing except exhausting its own supplies, while other Crusader fortresses remained untouched. But in 1177, that equation changed. Saladin had unified Egypt and Syria, eliminating the Muslim infighting that had saved the Crusaders for decades. Now a single commander controlled resources from the Nile to Damascus. And Saladin had learned from failed sieges. He wasn't going to waste months battering castle walls. His strategy was surgical: isolate fortresses, bypass them, strike at field armies, and force the Christians into open battle where numbers would decide everything. The kingdom's military situation in October 1177 was borderline hopeless. Of Baldwin's 600 knights in Jerusalem, roughly 300 were combat ready. The rest were wounded from previous skirmishes, too old for heavy cavalry work, or suffering from the diseases that plagued every medieval army: dysentery, fevers, infected wounds that wouldn't heal. Baldwin's infantry numbered maybe 2,000 men, mostly local Christians pressed into service, equipped with spears and leather armor, useful for garrison duty, but catastrophically outmatched against Saladin's professional soldiers. Think about what this meant tactically. If Baldwin called every knight from every castle to defend Jerusalem, he might assemble 1,000 heavy cavalry, and doing so would leave every fortress in the kingdom undermanned and vulnerable. But if he kept garrisons scattered, Saladin could bring his full 26,000-man army against any single position and overwhelm it through sheer numbers. There was no good option. Every choice led to disaster. The kingdom's leadership knew it. In August 1177, Raymond III of Tripoli had argued in council that the kingdom should seek a truce with Saladin. Buy time, hope the Sultan died, or his empire fractured. Baldwin had refused. He understood that truces with Saladin were just delays. The Sultan would use any pause to build more siege engines, train more Mamluks, and prepare for the final conquest. Better to fight now than wait for inevitable annihilation. But fighting required an army, and the mathematics were impossible. 2,000 Crusader knights versus 30,000 Muslim troops. Even if every Christian soldier was worth 5 Muslim soldiers, and they weren't, the numbers led to extinction. On October 18, 1177, Saladin crossed the border with 26,000 men, heading straight for Ascalon. The city's garrison sent desperate messages to Jerusalem: "Send reinforcements, or we fall." Baldwin read those messages and faced the defining decision of his reign: march to Ascalon's relief with his tiny army and risk everything in the field, or abandon the city and watch his kingdom's southern anchor collapse. He was 16 years old, dying of leprosy, and commanded an army that couldn't win. The choice should have been obvious: stay behind Jerusalem's walls and survive a few more months. But Baldwin wasn't interested in survival. He was interested in victory, no matter how impossible. And impossibility was about to get a masterclass. October 18th, 1177. Saladin crossed into Crusader territory with the largest army he'd ever assembled: 26,000 troops, including his personal guard of 3,000 Mamluk cavalry. Warriors taken as boys from the Caucasus, trained from childhood to fight, forbidden to marry, and loyal only to their sultan. His target wasn't Jerusalem, not yet, It was Ascalon, the coastal fortress blocking Egypt's land route to Syria. Take Ascalon, and Saladin could move armies freely between his territories. Leave it standing, and every campaign required dangerous sea voyages. The city's garrison sent desperate messages to Jerusalem. "We're under siege. Send help or we fall." Baldwin read the messages in his command chamber and faced an impossible choice. Ride out with his tiny army and risk everything, or abandon Ascalon and lose the kingdom's southern anchor. Ascalon wasn't just another fortress. It was the strategic linchpin of the entire kingdom. The city sat on the Mediterranean coast, 35 miles south of Jerusalem, controlling the coastal road between Egypt and Syria. Its garrison numbered 280 knights and 1,200 infantry under the command of Humphrey II of Tehran, one of Baldwin's most capable commanders. The fortifications were formidable. Triple walls, a deep moat, towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. In theory, Ascalon could withstand a siege for months. In practice, Saladin had brought 26,000 men and was prepared to starve them out or batter the walls to rubble, whichever came first. Here's what made this invasion different from every previous Muslim raid. Saladin wasn't probing for weakness or testing defenses. He'd committed his entire field army, every available Mamluk, every Turkish cavalry regiment, every siege engineer he could spare from Egypt and Syria. His supply train stretched for miles, wagons loaded with grain, portable forges for weapon repair, siege towers dismantled and ready for assembly, and enough arrows to blot out the sun. Muslim chroniclers recorded that Saladin told his commanders this campaign would end in one of two ways: Ascalon's surrender or its total destruction. There would be no withdrawal, no negotiated peace. This was conquest. October 20th, 1177. Baldwin convened his war council in Jerusalem's citadel. The room was packed with every major noble and military commander within reach. Raymond III of Tripoli, Reynald of Sidon, Balian of Ibelin, Reginald of Châtillon. These were hard men who'd spent decades fighting Muslim armies, and they all said the same thing: don't march to Ascalon's relief. It's suicide. Reynald of Sidon laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity. "Sire, you have perhaps 500 knights, fit for battle. Saladin has 26,000 men. If we ride out and he catches us in open ground, we'll be annihilated. Jerusalem will fall within the month. The kingdom dies." Think about that pressure. Every experienced commander in the room telling the 16-year-old leper king that marching out meant certain death. And they weren't wrong. Medieval military doctrine was absolutely clear. Avoid field battles when outnumbered more than 2 to 1. At 52 to 1 odds, engaging Saladin in open combat violated every principle of warfare. The smart move, the rational move, the move that every military historian would recommend was to let Ascalon fall, preserve the field army, and defend Jerusalem's massive fortifications where numbers mattered less. But here's where Baldwin revealed the mind that made him legendary. He stood, barely, his legs weak from advancing leprosy, and gave a response that chronicles recorded almost word for word. "If we abandon Ascalon, we announce to every garrison in the kingdom that Jerusalem will not come when they're besieged. Every commander, every soldier will know they stand alone. And when Saladin comes for the next fortress and the next, they'll surrender rather than die for a king who abandoned them. We ride to Ascalon not because we can save it, but because if we don't, the kingdom is already dead." The room went silent. Baldwin had just reframed the entire strategic equation. This wasn't about whether 500 knights could defeat 26,000 Muslims. It was about whether the kingdom of Jerusalem would fight for its own survival, or slowly bleed to death through abandonment and surrender. Raymond III leaned forward, his face hard. And when Saladin crushes us on the road to Ascalon, what then? Baldwin's response was barely a whisper, his disease-ravaged throat struggling to form words. Then we die fighting instead of waiting. Assemble the army. We march at dawn. On October 22nd, 1177, Baldwin IV led 500 knights out of Jerusalem's gates, heading south toward an army that outnumbered him 52-1. His nobles thought he was riding to his death. Saladin's scouts reported the Crusader movement and laughed. The leper boy was delivering himself to slaughter. Neither side knew that in 3 weeks, the course of medieval history would shatter like glass under a warhammer. November 1st, 1177. Baldwin called his war council and told them he was marching to relieve Ascalon. His officers stared at him like he'd lost his mind. One chronicler recorded the scene. Lord Reynold of Sidon spoke plainly. "Sire, you have 500 knights. Saladin has 26,000 men. This is suicide." Baldwin's response became legend. "Then we die defending our kingdom instead of watching it fall from behind walls. Assemble the army. We march at dawn." But here's what made this decision genuinely insane. Baldwin was physically falling apart. His leprosy had progressed to the point where he could barely grip reins. His face was covered in lesions. He couldn't feel his hands or feet. Medieval physicians had told him he had months to live, maybe a year, and he was about to lead a forced march into combat against impossible odds. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Baldwin's physical state in November 1177. The disease had destroyed most of the nerve endings in his hands. To hold anything, a sword, reins, a cup, his servants had to wrap his fingers around the object and tie them in place with silk cords. He rode with his hands literally bound to the reins because he couldn't feel whether he was gripping them or not. The lesions on his face had progressed to the point where he wore a silver mask in public, not for vanity, but because exposed sores attracted flies and infection. His feet were so damaged, he couldn't walk more than a few steps without stumbling. Knights had to lift him into the saddle. And once mounted, the pain was excruciating. Leprosy doesn't eliminate all sensation. It eliminates protective sensation. Baldwin couldn't feel pressure or temperature, but he could feel the deep, constant ache of tissue dying from the inside. Yet his mind remained diamond sharp. While his body betrayed him, Baldwin spent the next 48 hours planning a campaign that would have challenged a healthy commander. He had exactly 547 knights available in Jerusalem. He knew the precise count because he'd personally reviewed the muster rolls. Of those, 83 were over 50 years old, too experienced to waste, but too slow for shock cavalry. Another 62 were recovering from wounds or illness. That left 402 knights in fighting condition. He also had 1846 infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, and camp followers who could hold a shield wall but would be slaughtered by Turkish cavalry in open ground. Think about those numbers for a second. 402 effective knights against 26,000 Muslim troops, including 3,000 Mamluks who were specifically trained to kill European heavy cavalry. The mathematical disadvantage was 65-1 if you counted only combat-ready forces. Those aren't military odds. That's an execution waiting to happen. But Baldwin understood something his nobles didn't. He wasn't planning to fight Saladin's entire army in open battle. That would be suicide. Instead, he was gambling on something more subtle, the psychological impact of his presence. If Baldwin marched to Ascalon with Jerusalem's field army, Saladin would face a strategic dilemma. The Sultan could continue besieging Ascalon and risk a Christian relief force hitting his supply lines. Or he could lift the siege to deal with Baldwin, which would be a propaganda disaster, admitting he feared a teenage leper with 500 knights. Either way, Baldwin won politically, and if by some miracle an opportunity for actual combat emerged, well, he'd be there to seize it. November 3rd, 1177, pre-dawn. Jerusalem's courtyard filled with knights checking armor, squires loading pack horses, infantry sharpening spears. The air smelled of horse sweat, metal polish, and fear. These men knew the odds. They'd heard the numbers. Many had written final letters to families, confessing sins to priests, making peace with death. Baldwin appeared in the courtyard at 5 a.m., carried on a litter because he couldn't walk. His squires lifted him into the saddle of a massive warhorse, a destrier bred in France, 17 hands tall, trained not to spook at the smell of blood. The king's hands were already bound to the reins with silk cords. His silver mask caught the torchlight. For a long moment, he simply sat there, a dying boy in armor, looking at an army that couldn't win. Then he raised one bound hand, the gesture awkward, the fingers unresponsive, and the gate opened. 547 knights, 1846 infantry, and a 16-year-old with rotting flesh rode out of Jerusalem toward an enemy that outnumbered them 13-1. The chronicles say it was the bravest or most foolish decision in Crusader history. Within 3 weeks, it would prove to be both. And Saladin, confident and patient in his camp outside Ascalon, had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. November 10th, 1177. Baldwin's small army reached Ascalon and lifted the siege through sheer presence. Saladin withdrew south rather than fight a set-piece battle he didn't need. The Crusaders had won without swinging a sword. Mission accomplished. Go home. But then, 84 knights in white surcoats with red crosses rode into camp. Templars, the warrior monks, returning from a raid into Egypt. Their leader, Odo de Saint-Amand, was a hard-eyed fanatic who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and war. He brought news. Saladin's army had dispersed. The Sultan thought the Crusaders were done, so he'd sent thousands of troops raiding inland, scattering his forces across 50 miles of countryside, looting villages and stripping the land. Odo looked at Baldwin and said words that would echo through history. They're vulnerable. We can hit them. The leper king smiled. This was the opportunity he'd been praying for. Here's what you need to understand about the Knights Templar in 1177. They weren't just another military unit. They were the most disciplined, most feared, most tactically sophisticated fighting force in the medieval world. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims, the Templars had evolved into a warrior order that combined monastic discipline with professional military training. Every Templar knight took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, then spent every waking hour training for war. They drilled constantly in formation fighting, practiced charging and wheeling as a single unit, and maintained their equipment to standards that would impress modern special forces. A regular feudal knight might train a few hours per week between managing estates and political obligations. Templars trained 8 hours per day, every day for years. They were medieval shock troops, and 84 of them had just joined Baldwin's army. Odo de Saint-Amand was the perfect embodiment of Templar fanaticism. At 52 years old, he'd spent 3 decades fighting Muslims across the Holy Land. He was Grand Master of the Templar Order, answering only to the Pope, which meant he could tell kings to go to hell if he disagreed with their tactics. Chronicles describe him as severe of face, hard of word, and harder of deed. He'd launched the Egyptian raid without permission, taken his 84 knights deep into Muslim territory, burned supply depots, and returned with intelligence that would change everything. November 10th, 8:00 p.m. Baldwin's command tent. Odo spread out a crude map sketched on parchment and delivered his report. Saladin had made a catastrophic mistake. Believing the Crusader relief of Ascalon was a defensive maneuver, the Sultan had assumed Baldwin would retreat to Jerusalem and hunker down for winter. So Saladin had dispersed his 26,000-man army across southern Palestine in a massive raiding operation designed to strip the countryside of food and demoralize the Christian population before the real siege of Jerusalem began in spring. Odo's scouts had tracked the Muslim forces. 8,000 men under Saladin's direct command camped near Montgisard, a small settlement 15 miles northeast of Ascalon. Another 6,000 troops raiding villages 20 miles east. Another 5,000 spread out to the north. The remaining 7,000 conducting operations in various locations across a 50-mile radius. Think about what this meant. Saladin's overwhelming 26,000-man army had been broken into scattered raiding parties. His main force, 8,000 men, was isolated, separated from reinforcements by miles of rough terrain. And Baldwin, with his 631 knights, 547 from Jerusalem plus 84 Templars, was 15 miles away. For the first time since the invasion began, the Crusaders actually had something approaching reasonable odds. But here's where it gets insane. Even with Saladin's forces dispersed, Baldwin was still outnumbered 13-1 by the main Muslim camp at Montgisard. 8,000 professional Muslim troops, including Mamluks, versus 631 Christian knights. Those weren't good odds. They were just less suicidal than 26,000 to 631. And to exploit this opportunity, Baldwin would have to march his army 70 miles in 48 hours, an impossible pace for medieval forces, strike Saladin before the scattered raiding parties could return, and hope his cavalry could destroy 8,000 Muslims before being overwhelmed. Balian of Ibelin, one of Baldwin's senior commanders, laid out the obvious objection. "Sire, even if we reach Montgisard undetected, we're still catastrophically outnumbered. 8,000 Muslims will butcher 600 knights in open combat." Odo de Saint-Amand leaned forward, his scarred face catching the lamplight, and spoke with the absolute certainty of a religious fanatic. "Not if we hit them before they form up. Not if we charge at dawn while they're scattered across their camp. Not if we fight like the judgment of God himself has arrived." Baldwin sat silent, his bandaged hands resting on the map, his mask reflecting nothing. For 30 seconds, the only sound in the tent was the flutter of canvas in the wind. Then the Leper King spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute command. "We march in 2 hours, forced pace. No fires, no noise. Every man who can sit a horse will ride. We hit Saladin at dawn on November 25th, and we don't stop until his army is corpses or we are." The nobles exchanged glances. They'd just been ordered to attempt the impossible, a 70-mile forced march followed by a cavalry charge against impossible odds. Medieval military doctrine said this was insanity. Baldwin was betting his kingdom, his life, and 631 knights that Saladin wouldn't see him coming. And in 48 hours, the world would discover whether genius and desperation could overcome mathematics and military logic. November 23rd, 1177. Pre-dawn darkness. Baldwin gave an order that defied medieval military logic. Forced march, 70 miles in 48 hours. Full armor. Strike Saladin before he can concentrate his forces. Medieval armies moved 10-15 miles per day, maximum. Baldwin was demanding 35, in full chain mail, in November heat, with horses carrying 300 pounds of armored knight. Military historians still argue about how they did it. The answer, they almost didn't. Men vomited from heat exhaustion. Horses went lame and were left behind. Armor had to be carried on pack animals to save the war horse's strength. But Baldwin drove them forward with the kind of manic determination that only comes from knowing you're already dying. If he was going to hell anyway, he'd take Saladin with him. Here's what makes this march genuinely impossible. A destrier, a medieval war horse, weighs roughly 2,000 pounds and can carry about 400 pounds total, 180 pounds of knight, 60 pounds of chainmail, 40 pounds of weapons, plus saddle and provisions. Push that horse faster than a walk for extended periods, and it breaks down. Tendons snap, hooves crack. The animal collapses from cardiac stress. Professional medieval armies knew this, which is why they moved slowly, covering maybe 12 miles per day, with frequent rest stops. Baldwin was demanding his knights cover 35 miles per day for 2 consecutive days, while maintaining combat readiness at the end. It violated every principle of medieval logistics. But Baldwin had calculated something his commanders hadn't. They didn't need all 631 knights to arrive. They needed enough to launch a devastating first strike. So he implemented a brutal triage system. The 84 Templars, who maintained their horses to obsessive standards, would ride fully armored and ready for immediate combat. They were the strike force. The 547 secular knights would march in shifts, 12 hours wearing armor, 12 hours with armor loaded on pack animals to spare the horses. Anyone whose mount went lame would transfer to a spare horse. If no spares remained, that knight would be left behind with the infantry, who were marching separately at normal pace and would arrive days late. November 23rd, 10:00 a.m., 6 hours into the march. The column stretched for nearly a mile along the coastal road heading northeast toward Montgisard. Temperature 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity low, but the Mediterranean sun beat down on metal armor like a forge. Inside their chainmail, knights cooked. Sweat poured down faces, soaked through padded gambesons, turned metal rings into scalding mesh that burned exposed skin at the neck and wrists. Men began falling out of formation, stumbling to the roadside to vomit or collapse. By noon, 23 horses had gone lame. By 2 p.m., 47 knights had been left behind, their mounts unable to continue. Think about what this meant for morale. Every hour, the army got weaker. Every mile, more men dropped out. The knights who continued didn't know if they were marching to battle or simply dying slower than their comrades. And leading this death march was a 16-year-old whose hands were tied to his reins because leprosy had destroyed his ability to grip. Here's where it gets insane. Baldwin couldn't feel his legs. The disease had progressed to the point where he had no sensation below the knees, which meant he couldn't tell if he was properly seated in the saddle or about to fall. His squires rode on either side, constantly checking his position, adjusting his weight, making sure he didn't topple sideways from exhaustion. Chronicles record that Baldwin refused all rest stops. When his commanders begged him to pause for water, he replied, "Saladin's scouts will detect us by tomorrow. We have one chance. Hit him before he knows we're coming. Every hour we delay, those odds get worse." November 24th, 4 a.m., 32 hours into the march. The column moved through darkness, navigating by starlight and the experience of local guides who knew the terrain. No torches. Light would reveal their position to Muslim scouts. No talking. Sound carried for miles in the desert night. Just the thunder of 1-200 iron-shod hooves hitting packed earth, the creak of leather, the labored breathing of exhausted horses and men. November 24th, 6 p.m. 44 hours into the march. 63 horses dead or abandoned. 91 knights left behind. The remaining 540 riders approached a ridgeline 3 miles south of Montgisard. Scout reports confirmed Saladin's main camp lay just beyond, spread across a valley near a stream. 8,000 Muslim troops, scattered and unprepared, with no idea that 540 Christian knights were 180 minutes away. Baldwin called his commanders forward. His voice was barely audible, his throat destroyed by disease and dehydration. "We rest here until 4 a.m. Feed the horses, water the men. At dawn, we charge. No formations, no complicated tactics. We hit them like God's hammer, and we don't stop killing until they break, or we do." Odo de Saint-Amand looked at the exhausted, half-dead army, and then at the leper king who'd driven them 70 miles in 48 hours through sheer force of will. The Templar, Grand Master, said what everyone was thinking. "Sire, we're about to charge 8,000 Muslims with 540 half-dead knights. This is madness." Baldwin's response would be recorded in every chronicle of the battle. "Then let's show Saladin what madmen can do." In 6 hours, the sun would rise over Montgisard, and the medieval world would discover that sometimes impossibility is just mathematics that hasn't met desperation yet. November 24th, 1177. While Baldwin's army moved north like a steel-tipped arrow, Saladin made the decision that would destroy him. His scouts reported the Crusaders had lifted Ascalon's siege and gone home to Jerusalem. Good. Campaign over. Time to loot. He split his massive army into raiding parties, sending thousands of troops fanning out across the countryside to burn villages, seize livestock, and terrorize Christian settlements. The core of his army, maybe 8,000 men, including his Mamluk guard, set up camp near a place called Montgisard, a low hill with a stream, good grazing for horses. Saladin's intelligence was excellent, his logistics were flawless, and his tactical execution was perfect. Except for one small problem. Baldwin wasn't in Jerusalem. He was 15 miles away, closing fast, and Saladin had no idea he was coming. Here's what the Muslim chronicles don't tell you. Saladin's decision to disperse his forces wasn't reckless. It was textbook medieval military strategy. He'd achieved his primary objective, forcing Baldwin to abandon Ascalon's relief by withdrawing south, demonstrating Crusader weakness without wasting men in a siege. Now, with winter approaching and the campaign season ending, standard practice dictated maximizing the raid's economic value. Strip the countryside of food and livestock, burn Christian villages, demoralize the population, then withdraw to Egypt with plunder and slaves. The dispersed raiding parties would reconverge in 2 weeks for the march home. It was logical, methodical, and exactly what any competent medieval commander would do in Saladin's position. The force dispersal was systematic and calculated. Saladin kept 8,000 troops with him at Montgisard, 3,000 Mamluks from his personal guard, 2,500 Turkish cavalry, 1,800 Syrian infantry, and 700 Egyptian archers. He sent 6,200 troops under Emir Badr al-Din northeast toward Ramla to raid Christian farms. Another 4,800 soldiers moved east toward Hebron under Emir Shams al-Din. A force of 3,500 went north toward Jaffa. The remaining 3,500 scattered in smaller raiding bands across a 40-mile radius. Think about those numbers. Saladin had split his overwhelming 26,000-man advantage into 6 separate forces, none within supporting distance of the others. The scattered units were 15 to 25 miles apart across rough terrain. Even if one group detected a Crusader attack, it would take 8 to 12 hours minimum for reinforcements to arrive. But Saladin's scouts had confirmed Baldwin's retreat. Multiple reconnaissance parties reported the Christian army marching north from Ascalon, back toward Jerusalem on November 11th. The reports were accurate. That's exactly what Baldwin had done initially. What the scouts missed was Baldwin's sudden reversal on November 23rd, when the Templars arrived with intelligence about the dispersed Muslim forces. Saladin's intelligence network, normally excellent, had a 48-hour information gap. And in medieval warfare, 48 hours was an eternity. November 24th, 6:00 p.m. Montgisard camp. Saladin sat in his command tent reviewing supply manifests and discussing next week's march route back to Egypt with his commanders. Outside, 8,000 Muslim soldiers relaxed in a camp that sprawled across half a mile of valley floor. Tents were pitched in loose clusters organized by unit, not in defensive formations. Horses grazed freely along the stream. Cooking fires dotted the landscape, hundreds of them visible for miles. Sentries were posted, but their focus was on the south and east, the directions from which Muslim raiding parties would return. No one was watching the ridgeline to the southwest, where 540 Christian knights crouched in darkness, 3 miles away. Here's where Saladin's tactical situation became catastrophically vulnerable. His 8,000 troops were scattered across the camp in a posture designed for rest and resupply, not combat. The Mamluks, his elite shock troops, were concentrated near Saladin's tent in the center. Good for protecting the Sultan, terrible for responding to an attack on the camp's perimeter. The cavalry horses were unsaddled and dispersed along the stream, meaning it would take 20 to 30 minutes minimum to catch, saddle, and mount them for battle. The infantry was intermixed with baggage trains and support personnel. In military terms, Saladin's camp was a soft target. Maximum vulnerability, minimum defensive readiness. And the Sultan had no idea anything was wrong. His evening reports showed all raiding parties proceeding according to plan. His scouts reported no Crusader activity within 50 miles. The campaign was effectively over. Tomorrow he'd begin recalling the dispersed forces for the march to Egypt. Tonight, his army could rest. 3 miles away, on a dark ridgeline, Baldwin IV sat motionless on his warhorse, hands bound to the reins, silver mask reflecting starlight. His scouts had returned with detailed intelligence, camp layout, sentry positions, the exact location of Saladin's tent. The Leper King studied the valley below, watching hundreds of cooking fires twinkle in the darkness like stars. 8,000 Muslim soldiers, completely unprepared, about to face 540 knights in the most devastating cavalry charge of the medieval era. Odo de Saint-Amand rode up beside Baldwin and spoke quietly. "Sire, if we hit them at dawn before they can form ranks, we might actually survive this." Baldwin turned his masked face toward the Templar Grand Master and corrected him with a whisper that barely carried over the wind. "We're not here to survive. We're here to destroy them." In 8 hours, the sun would rise over Montgisard. Saladin would wake to find his greatest mistake wasn't dispersing his army. It was underestimating a dying boy who'd turned desperation into a weapon sharper than any sword in Christendom. November 25th, 1177. Dawn broke cold over Montgisard. Crusader scouts returned with news that made hardened knights go pale. Saladin's camp, 8,000 men, scattered across the valley, completely unprepared, with another 18,000 Muslim troops dispersed miles away on raids. Baldwin had approximately 500 knights and 2,000 infantry. The infantry would never make it in time. They were miles behind the cavalry. So the equation was stark: 500 armored knights versus 8,000 Muslim warriors, who would soon be reinforced by another 18,000. Odo de Saint-Amand looked at the Muslim camp through the morning haze and said what everyone was thinking. "If we hit them now, before they form up, we might actually survive this." Baldwin gave the order that would define his legend. "We don't survive it, we win it. Charge on my signal." 6 to 12 first light. The Crusader knights assembled along the ridgeline in absolute silence. 540 mounted warriors arranged in a formation that would become legendary in military history: the wedge. The Templars formed the spear point, 84 white surcoated fanatics who'd spent their entire lives training for exactly this moment. Behind them, arranged in a V shape that stretched 200 yards wide and 150 yards deep. The secular knights of Jerusalem positioned themselves in tight ranks, knee to knee, each man's left side protected by his neighbor's shield. This wasn't a loose medieval charge. This was a precision instrument designed to punch through enemy formations like a lance through flesh. Here's what made this formation genuinely terrifying. Each destrier weighed approximately 2,000 pounds. Each knight in full armor added another 240 pounds, 180 pounds of man, 60 pounds of mail, and weapons. That's 2,240 pounds per mounted warrior. Multiply by 540 knights, and you're looking at 209,600 pounds of steel, horseflesh, and rage about to slam into an unprepared camp at 30 miles per hour. The kinetic energy would be catastrophic. But it only worked if they maintained formation and struck before the Muslims could organize a defense. One mistake, one broken rank, and the wedge would shatter. The knights would be isolated and slaughtered. Baldwin positioned himself at the wedge's tip, directly behind the Templar vanguard. His squires had strapped him into the saddle with leather cords wrapped around his thighs. Without sensation in his legs, he couldn't grip with his knees, and a cavalry charge would throw him from the horse in seconds without restraints. His hands were bound to the reins as always, but in his right hand, held upright by silk cords tied to his wrist, Baldwin gripped something that would become the battle's psychological weapon, the true cross, a reliquary containing what Christians believed was wood from Christ's crucifixion. The golden cross caught the dawn light and blazed like a beacon. Think about what that symbol meant to medieval warriors. This wasn't just a religious icon. It was the physical manifestation of divine approval. Crusaders believed that fighting under the true cross meant God himself sanctioned their battle. For the 45 knights staring down at 8,000 Muslims, that belief was the only thing standing between courage and total terror. Baldwin knew it. He raised the true cross high, his bound hand trembling from disease, but holding the relic steady, and every knight on that ridgeline saw it burn gold in the sunrise. 6:28 a.m. Below in the valley, the Muslim camp began to stir. Cooking fires were being rekindled. Soldiers emerged from tents. Horses grazed along the stream. Sentries walked their posts, bored and cold, watching the southern horizon where Muslim raiding parties would eventually return. No one was looking southwest toward the ridgeline where 540 Christian knights sat motionless in the dawn shadows, 800 yards away. But here's where Saladin's vulnerability became absolute. Muslim scouts had finally detected the Crusader presence. A sentry spotted reflected light from armor on the ridge at 6:15 a.m. and sent a runner to Saladin's tent. The Sultan emerged, saw the Christian forces assembling, and immediately began shouting orders. But organizing 8,000 scattered troops into defensive formations takes time. Cavalry horses had to be caught, saddled, and mounted. 15 minutes minimum. Infantry had to grab weapons, form ranks, establish position, 10 minutes if they were professionals, 20 if they panicked. The Mamluks, Saladin's elite guard, could deploy faster, but they were camped in the valley center, 600 yards from where the Christian charge would hit. Saladin had perhaps 12 minutes to prepare for impact. Baldwin wasn't going to give him 5. 6:31 a.m. The leper king turned in his saddle, awkwardly, his body strapped in place, and looked back at 540 knights who'd marched 70 miles in 48 hours, who'd watched comrades drop from exhaustion, who knew they were about to charge into odds that defied survival. Chronicles record that Baldwin spoke only 10 words, but every man heard them clearly in the cold morning air. For God, for Jerusalem, and for those we've already lost. Then Baldwin IV, unable to feel the horse beneath him, unable to grip the reins except through silk bindings, dying of leprosy at age 16, raised the true cross toward heaven and screamed a single word that echoed across the valley like the voice of judgment itself. Charge! 40 destriers lunged forward as one. The ground shook. The sound of 2,160 iron-shod hooves hitting earth in perfect unison created thunder that Muslim soldiers would describe in chronicles as the sound of the world ending. The wedge accelerated down the slope, gaining speed with every stride, transforming from armored warriors into an unstoppable avalanche of steel. In the valley below, Saladin watched the Crusader charge descend toward his unprepared camp and realized with crystalline horror that he'd made the worst tactical mistake of his life. His scouts had been wrong. The leper boy hadn't retreated to Jerusalem. He'd come to destroy everything. And now, 540 Christian knights were 6 seconds from impact. 10 a.m., November 25th, 1177. Baldwin IV, his hands wrapped in silk bandages soaked with medicinal oils, unable to feel the reins he held, raised the true cross, a relic of Christ's crucifixion that crusaders carried into battle, and screamed a single word that echoed across the valley. Charge! 500 knights in full plate armor on war horses, bred for size and power, launched forward like a medieval missile. The ground shook. The sound of 2,000 iron-shod hooves hitting earth in unison created a thunder that Muslim chroniclers would describe as the voice of judgment. What happened next was physics meets psychology. 500 tons of steel and horseflesh, moving at 30 miles per hour, slammed into an unprepared camp like a wrecking ball hitting a house of cards. But it wasn't just momentum, it was terror. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the physics of a medieval cavalry charge. A destrier at full gallop generates approximately 15,000 pounds of force at impact, roughly equivalent to a modern car hitting a wall at 30 mph. Multiply that by 540 horses striking simultaneously across a 200-yard front, and you're looking at 1,000 pounds of kinetic energy hitting the Muslim camp in the span of 3 seconds. The first line of Muslim infantry, approximately 400 men trying desperately to form a defensive shield wall, simply ceased to exist. Bodies were trampled, crushed under 2-ton war horses that didn't slow, didn't swerve, didn't stop. The Templars at the wedge's point crashed through the Muslim line like a spear through parchment. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical destruction. Muslim soldiers woke that morning expecting a routine day of camp maintenance and patrol duty. Instead, they got 540 armored knights materializing out of the dawn, the true cross blazing gold at the formation center, and the sound of hoofbeats that one chronicler described as the earth itself screaming. Panic is contagious in combat, and it spread through Saladin's camp like wildfire. Soldiers who'd been trying to form defensive positions broke and ran. Cavalry still attempting to saddle horses abandoned the effort and fled on foot. The camp's outer perimeter, roughly 2,000 men, disintegrated in the first 90 seconds of contact. But here's where the Crusader charge could have failed catastrophically. Once the wedge penetrated deep into the Muslim camp, the formation had to transition from linear assault to circular defense, the hedgehog formation that would allow the knights to fight in all directions without exposing their vulnerable flanks and rear. This transition was the most dangerous moment in any cavalry charge, the point where momentum stopped and close quarters combat began. If the knights bunched up or lost cohesion, Turkish archers and Mamluk cavalry would surround and destroy them through concentrated missile fire and flanking attacks. The Templars executed the transition perfectly. At the wedge's deepest penetration point, approximately 300 yards into the Muslim camp, near Saladin's command tent, Odo de Saint-Amand gave a signal, a horn blast that every Templar recognized from years of drill. The wedge exploded outward, transforming from a spear into a circular formation 150 yards in diameter. Knights wheeled their destriers in coordinated arcs, creating a rotating wall of armor, horse flesh, and swinging blades. Any Muslim soldier who approached the circle's edge met 3-foot longswords swung with the full force of armored men on horseback, strikes that could decapitate, dismember, or crush through leather and bone with equal ease. Think about what this meant tactically. The Crusaders had just turned themselves into a mobile fortress in the center of Saladin's camp. Muslim forces outnumbered them 15-1, but they couldn't bring those numbers to bear effectively. The hedgehog formation meant Christian knights only had to defend a 150-yard perimeter, and their armor made them nearly invulnerable to the arrows and light weapons of Muslim infantry. Mamluks could potentially break the formation with sustained cavalry charges, but they needed time to organize, mount, and coordinate. Time the Crusaders weren't giving them. Baldwin, strapped to his saddle in the formation's center, held the true cross high with his bound hands. Chronicles record that he was barely conscious from the shock of the charge. The violence of impact, combined with his disease-ravaged body, should have killed him outright. But the silk cords kept him upright, and the golden cross kept burning in the morning sun, visible across the entire battlefield. Every Christian knight could see it. Every Muslim soldier could see it. And the psychological message was absolute. God was present, and he was fighting for the Crusaders. 6:37 a.m., 6 minutes after the charge began, Saladin's camp had transformed into a slaughterhouse. Muslim casualties in the initial impact, estimated 801,000 Osari were killed or wounded. Crusader casualties, 12 knights dead, 34 wounded. The numbers defied belief. But the battle was far from over. Saladin, watching from a hilltop 400 yards away, where he'd retreated with his Mamluk guard, stared at the golden cross blazing in his camp's center and realized he was facing something no military training had prepared him for. A dying boy who just turned physics, psychology, and sheer desperate courage into the most devastating cavalry charge in medieval history. The Sultan's elite troops were finally mounted and ready to counterattack. The real battle was about to begin. The Crusader charge wasn't a mindless stampede. It was a precisely engineered killing formation called the wedge. Picture a spear point, Baldwin at the tip, the Templars forming the edges, the secular knights filling the mass. The formation was designed to punch through enemy lines like a blade through flesh, with the wedge's point absorbing the initial impact while the sides peeled enemy formations apart. Once inside the enemy position, the wedge would explode outward, turning into a circular formation called a hedgehog. Knights fighting back-to-back, horses wheeling, swords swinging in coordinated arcs that created zones of death. Muslim cavalry relied on mobility, archery, and tactical withdrawal. They expected to skirmish, harass, fall back, regroup. They did not expect 500 European madmen to crash into their camp at full gallop and start killing everything that moved. Here's what made the wedge formation genuinely revolutionary. Most medieval armies charged in loose lines or disorganized masses, brave but chaotic, effective only if you had overwhelming numbers. The wedge was different. It concentrated maximum force at a single point while maintaining unit cohesion through the entire assault. The 84 Templars at the formation's tip were the shock troops, the hammer that broke enemy resistance. Behind them, arranged in precise V-shaped ranks, 456 secular knights provided mass and momentum. The geometry was critical. The wedge measured approximately 30 yards wide at the tip, expanding to 200 yards at the base, creating a formation that was 150 yards deep from front to rear. This meant enemy forces couldn't simply flow around the flanks. The wedge was too wide, and they couldn't stop it through frontal resistance. The concentrated mass at the point was unstoppable. Think about the training required to execute this formation. Every knight had to maintain exact spacing, 3 feet between horses, knee-to-knee contact with neighbors, while galloping at 30 mph across broken ground. If one rider fell or swerved, he could trigger a cascade of collisions that would shatter the entire formation. The Templars drilled this maneuver for years, practicing coordinated charges until they could execute them in their sleep. The secular knights had maybe a week of hasty preparation during the march to Ascalon. That they managed to hold formation through the initial charge was a miracle of discipline and desperation. But the real genius was the hedgehog transition. At 6:33 a.m., 90 seconds after initial impact, the wedge reached its deepest penetration, 300 yards into the Muslim camp. At this point, standard cavalry tactics would demand the knights break off, wheel around, and charge again. But Odo de Saint-Amand understood something most medieval commanders didn't. Once you're inside the enemy position, you don't leave. You become the position. The horn signal blasted. The wedge exploded outward. Knights wheeled their destriers in coordinated arcs, transforming a linear spear into a circular fortress. The formation now measured 150 yards in diameter, rotating counterclockwise, each knight protecting his neighbor's flank. Here's where the killing became industrial. A destrier in a controlled wheel can complete a 180-degree turn in approximately 4 seconds. A knight with a 3-foot longsword has an effective striking radius of 7 feet from horseback. In the hedgehog formation, that meant every 4 seconds, each knight could engage new targets across a 14-foot arc. Multiply by 540 knights rotating continuously, and you're looking at a formation that created 7,560 feet of lethal edge, nearly 1.5 miles of sword strikes, refreshing every 4 seconds. Muslim soldiers approaching the formation faced impossible math. To reach a Christian knight, you had to cross 7 feet of sword arc without being cut down, then somehow pull an armored man off a 2,000-pound warhorse before his neighbor killed you. The casualties reflected this brutal calculus. Between 6:33 a.m. and 6:45 a.m., 12 minutes of hedgehog combat. Muslim losses mounted at catastrophic rates. Chronicles record Muslim dead stacking 3 bodies deep around the formation's perimeter. Turkish archers fired arrows that bounced off plate armor or embedded in horse barding without penetrating. Syrian infantry with spears tried to form shield walls and were trampled by wheeling destriers that simply rode over them. The numbers tell the story. Estimated 2,200 to 500 additional Muslim casualties in those 12 minutes. Crusader losses, 8 knights killed, 23 wounded. But Saladin's Mamluks, 3,000 of Islam's deadliest cavalry, were finally mounted, organized, and ready to counterattack. These weren't panicked infantry or lightly armored archers. These were professional warriors who'd trained their entire lives to kill European knights. And they were about to hit the hedgehog from all sides simultaneously. 6:46 a.m. The real test of the wedge formation was about to begin. Because maintaining a rotating defensive circle against determined cavalry assault required more than geometry and discipline. It required endurance that 540 exhausted knights who'd marched 70 miles in 48 hours and just fought for 13 minutes straight might not have left. Baldwin, barely conscious in the formation's center, watched 3,000 Mamluks form up for the charge and realized the impossible part wasn't the victory they'd just achieved. It was surviving the next 5 minutes. From 10 a.m. to 10:17 a.m., the Crusaders turned Montgisard into an abattoir. Saladin's men tried to form ranks, but the speed of the charge gave them no time. Knights on destriers, war horses weighing 2,000 pounds, simply rode over infantry. Lances punched through leather armor and bodies like they were paper. When lances shattered, knights drew swords. 3-foot blades swung from horseback with the full momentum of an armored man and started cutting. Muslim archers, deadly at range, were useless in melee. Turkish cavalry, brilliant in open field maneuvers, couldn't maneuver in the chaos of their own camp. The Mamluks, Saladin's elite guard, fought with suicidal courage and died in heaps. Chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing years later, described the scene with brutal honesty. The Franks fell upon us like lions upon sheep. In 17 minutes, the army of Islam became a slaughterhouse. 10:03 a.m., 3 minutes into the slaughter, Saladin's 3,000 Mamluks finally launched their counterattack, hitting the Crusader hedgehog from 3 directions simultaneously. These weren't panicked infantry. These were professional cavalry warriors riding Arabian horses bred for speed and endurance, wielding curved scimitars designed for mounted combat, trained since childhood to fight in coordinated units. They crashed into the Christian formation, expecting to shatter it through superior numbers and maneuverability. What they got instead was a lesson in why European heavy cavalry dominated medieval battlefields. Here's what the Muslim chronicles don't tell you. The Mamluk counterattack should have worked. 3,000 cavalry hitting 540 exhausted knights from multiple angles should have broken the hedgehog formation and turned the battle into a massacre of Christians. But the Mamluks faced a problem no amount of training could solve: physics. An Arabian horse weighs approximately 900 pounds. A Mamluk warrior plus equipment adds maybe 200 pounds. Total, 100 pounds of horse and rider moving at 25 mph. A European destrier weighs 2,000 pounds. A knight in full armor adds 240 pounds. Total, 2,240 pounds moving at 20 mph. When those forces collided, the lighter Arabian horses were knocked sideways, stumbled, or simply bounced off the heavier destriers like cars hitting trucks. The casualty math was brutal. Between 10:03 and 10:08 a.m., 5 minutes of sustained Mamluk assault. Muslim losses mounted at approximately 180 men per minute. Think about that number. 3 dead Muslim warriors every 10 seconds, stacking up around the Christian formation in windrows of corpses and screaming horses. The Mamluks kept charging, kept dying, kept trying to break through sheer determination what they couldn't break through force. Scimitars rang off plate armor, arrows embedded in horse barding without penetrating. Spears shattered against shield walls. And all the while, Christian longswords kept swinging, kept cutting, kept killing with mechanical efficiency. But here's where the Crusaders nearly lost everything. Exhaustion was setting in. Knights who'd marched 70 miles, charged at full gallop, and fought for 8 minutes straight were running on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. Arms burned from swinging 3-pound swords. Horses stumbled from fatigue. The hedgehog formation began to waver. Gaps opened between knights. The rotation slowed. The defensive perimeter contracted from 150 yards to 120 yards as wounded and exhausted riders fell back toward the center. 10:11 a.m., the critical moment. A group of 200 Mamluks, led by one of Saladin's most experienced commanders, Emir Izz al-Din, concentrated their assault on a single 30-yard section of the hedgehog's perimeter. They'd identified the weak point: a cluster of secular knights whose horses were visibly flagging, whose sword arms were dropping between strikes. The Mamluks charged in tight formation, absorbed the initial sword strikes, and started pushing through physical mass and desperation. For 40 seconds, it looked like the Christian line would break. Then the Templars intervened. Odo de Saint-Amand led 30 white surcoated fanatics directly into the breach. What followed was combat so savage that Muslim chroniclers would later call it demonic. The Templars didn't fight like exhausted men. They fought like machines, swords swinging in coordinated patterns, horses wheeling in perfect synchronization, each knight covering his neighbor's flank with mathematical precision. Emir Izz al-Din was cut down in the first 10 seconds. A Templar sword took his head off at the neck. The 200 Mamluks who'd nearly broken the line were reduced to 40 survivors in under 2 minutes. 10:14 a.m. Something shifted in the Muslim army. You could feel it ripple through their ranks like a physical wave. The realization that they weren't going to win, that the Christian formation wouldn't break, that every charge just added more bodies to the piles of dead surrounding the hedgehog. Saladin's troops had lost approximately 2,400 men in 14 minutes, 30% of the force that had been encamped that morning. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, and staring at a formation of Christian knights who looked like they could fight forever. 10:17 a.m. 17 minutes after Baldwin's charge began, the Muslim army broke. Not all at once. Military collapses never happen cleanly, but section by section, unit by unit. Turkish cavalry stopped charging and started retreating. Syrian infantry threw down weapons and ran. Even the Mamluks, who'd fought with suicidal courage, began pulling back, disengaging, looking for escape routes. Saladin, watching from his hilltop command post 400 yards away, realized he'd lost not just a battle, but his entire army. And the leper king, barely conscious in the center of the Christian formation, was about to transform tactical victory into strategic annihilation. Because the killing wasn't over. It was just beginning. Here's what shocked the medieval world. Saladin fled. The greatest Muslim general since the Prophet, the man who'd vowed to retake Jerusalem, ran for his life on a racing camel while his bodyguard died to buy him seconds. This wasn't cowardice. It was tactical survival. Saladin saw his army disintegrating and made the hardest decision a commander can make: live to fight another day. He abandoned his camp, his supplies, his siege engines, his treasure, and thousands of his men. He rode 120 miles back to Egypt in 48 hours, alone, humiliated, while behind him the Crusaders hunted his shattered army across the Palestinian hills like wolves chasing deer. The psychological impact was devastating. Saladin had built his reputation on invincibility. In 17 minutes, a dying teenager had reduced him to a refugee. 10:18 a.m. Saladin stood on his command hilltop and watched his army collapse in real time. The numbers told a story no commander wants to read. 2,400 dead in 17 minutes. Another 800 wounded and out of action. Approximately 1,200 troops in full retreat. Of his original 8,000-man force, maybe 3,600 remained combat effective. And those men were scattered, demoralized, and staring at a Christian formation that had just butchered the best troops in the Muslim world. Worse, Saladin's dispersed raiding parties, 18,000 troops spread across 50 miles, had no idea the main force had been destroyed. They wouldn't return for hours, maybe days. By then, it would be too late. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that moment. Saladin's senior commanders were begging him to mount a final, desperate counterattack with every remaining soldier, to die fighting rather than retreat in disgrace. Muslim military culture valued martyrdom and jihad above almost everything. Running from infidels was the ultimate shame. But Saladin understood something his officers didn't. Losing one battle was recoverable. Losing the Sultan, the political and military leader who held the entire Egyptian-Syrian alliance together, would shatter the Muslim war effort for a generation. If Saladin died at Montgisard, his empire would fracture into rival factions within months. Better to live, rebuild, and return. 10:23 a.m. The Sultan made his choice. He ordered his 300-man personal guard to form a rear guard and hold the Crusaders for as long as possible. Then Saladin mounted a racing camel, faster than horses over long distances in desert terrain, and rode south toward Egypt with only 5 attendants. Think about that image. The most powerful Muslim leader in the world, who'd entered Christian territory with 26,000 troops 3 weeks earlier, now fleeing on a camel with a handful of servants. The humiliation was total. But here's where Saladin's losses became catastrophic. He left everything behind. His command tent, containing strategic maps and campaign plans. His personal treasury, an estimated 50,000 dinars in gold coin meant to pay troops. Siege engines, massive trebuchets and mangonels that had taken months to build and required teams of engineers to operate. Supply wagons loaded with food, weapons, and armor. And most devastating, his reputation for invincibility, which had been the psychological foundation of his entire military strategy. 10:18 a.m., November 25th, 1177. Saladin stood on his hilltop and watched his army collapse. The numbers told a story no commander wants to read. 2,400 dead in 17 minutes, 800 wounded, 200 in full retreat. Of his 8,000-man force, maybe 3,600 remained effective. The dispersed raiding parties, 18,000 troops spread across 50 miles, had no idea the main force had been destroyed. Here's what shocked the medieval world. Saladin fled. The greatest Muslim general since the Prophet ran for his life on a racing camel while his bodyguard died to buy him seconds. This wasn't cowardice, it was survival. He understood that losing one battle was recoverable. Losing the Sultan would shatter the Egyptian-Syrian alliance for a generation. 10:23 a.m. Saladin ordered his 300-man guard to form a rear guard and hold the Crusaders. Then he mounted a racing camel and rode south toward Egypt with 5 attendants. The most powerful Muslim leader in the world, who'd entered Christian territory with 26,000 troops, now fled alone. The humiliation was total. He left everything: his command tent, strategic maps, 50,000 dinars in gold, siege engines, supply wagons, and his reputation for invincibility. The Crusaders captured 200 horses, 300 camels, 47 siege engines, and supplies worth 200,000 dinars, more than Jerusalem's annual tax revenue. 10:35 a.m. Baldwin gave orders through Odo de Saint-Amand. Hunt them down. Knights broke into pursuit groups of 20 to 30 riders, fanning out across Palestine, chasing scattered Muslims. What followed wasn't battle, it was butchery. Exhausted infantry running on foot were ridden down. Turkish cavalry on lighter horses were caught and killed. Between 10:35 a.m. and 4 p.m., an additional 1,800 to 2,200 Muslim soldiers died during pursuit. The battle lasted 17 minutes and killed 2,400. The pursuit lasted 6 hours and killed nearly as many. Chronicles describe roads littered with bodies, streams running red, vultures blocking out the sun. Baldwin wanted strategic annihilation. Every escaped Muslim could fight again in Saladin's next campaign. So he ordered total pursuit. Chase them to Egypt or Syria, capture or kill everyone, leave no organized units intact. November 26th, a 900-man Turkish cavalry unit was ambushed near Ramla by 60 Templars. Casualties: 340 killed, 20 captured. November 27th, a 1,200-man Syrian column was caught in open ground. They held 40 minutes, then broke. 600 killed, 300 captured. By November 28th, total Muslim casualties: 8,000, 10,000 killed, 2,000, 3,000 captured, 4,000, 5,000 scattered. Only 8,000, 10,000 escaped, less than 40% of the original invasion force. But here's the dark truth. Crusaders weren't taking many prisoners. Captured soldiers meant mouths to feed and potential escapees. Most prisoners were executed. Chronicles describe mass killings, hundreds beheaded in groups to save time. Saladin reached Cairo on November 27th. Having ridden 120 miles in 48 hours, he entered his palace alone, exhausted, humiliated. Courtiers expecting victory found a sultan who'd lost an army to a teenage leper. November 28th. The battlefield was a charnel house. 8,000 to 10,000 Muslim corpses scattered across 3 square miles. In 75-degree heat, decomposition accelerated. The smell was overpowering. Wild dogs and vultures arrived by thousands. Water sources contaminated. Risk of plague catastrophic. Baldwin ordered burial details, but the math was impossible. A 50-man crew could bury 100 bodies per day. It would take 800 to 1,000-man days. The solution? Mass pyres. Corpses stacked 200 to 300 high, doused with oil, burned. Smoke visible from Jerusalem 20 miles away. The fires burned 6 days. Of 540 knights who charged, 180 were dead, 270 wounded. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had 2,000 knights total. This battle killed or wounded 23% of the entire heavy cavalry force. The kingdom lost a generation of warriors. Medieval medicine offered 3 treatments: cauterization, amputation, or prayer. Survival rates for serious wounds, 40%. Of 270 wounded crusaders, 110 to 120 would die from infection within 2 weeks. November 29th, dawn. Baldwin collapsed. The battle had pushed his disease-ravaged body beyond limits. Physicians examined him with horror, lesions spreading, advanced tissue necrosis, fever spiking. Their prognosis to Odo de Saint-Amand: weeks, perhaps a month. The battle had accelerated the disease. The leper king had won his impossible victory, and it was killing him. Montgisard didn't end the Crusades, but it bought Jerusalem time. Saladin spent 3 years rebuilding. He didn't invade again until 1179, cautious, remembering the leper who turned his world to ashes. Before Montgisard, Saladin commanded 30,000 to 35,000 troops, faced a fragmented 12,000-man crusader kingdom. After, he'd lost 10,000 men, 30% of his strength, plus equipment, supplies, and invincibility. Training new Mamluks took 8 to 10 years. Replacing siege engines took months. Restoring morale, a generation. Politically, the defeat was devastating. Saladin had promised 1177 would bring liberation. Instead, he returned alone on a camel. His rivals seized on defeat. Chronicles record Emir Saif ad-Din's mocking letter. Perhaps the Sultan needs instruction from those who haven't fled from leper boys. The insult nearly triggered civil war. For Crusaders, impact was transformational. Within 6 months, raiding parties struck deep into Muslim territory, unthinkable before. Templars and Hospitallers built aggressive forward castles challenging Muslim control. But the victory had a dark edge. Montgisard made Baldwin indispensable, and Baldwin was dying. By 1179, blind. By 1183, couldn't walk, carried on litters. Yet nobles refused replacement because they'd seen his genius. Baldwin died in 1185, aged 24, blind, unable to walk or speak clearly. He'd ruled 11 years, won impossible battles, held Jerusalem through will alone. 2 years later, July 4th, 1187, Battle of Hattin. Guy de Lusignan led crusaders into disaster. Saladin, who'd spent a decade learning, lured them into waterless desert and destroyed them. Of 20,000 crusaders, fewer than 3,000 escaped. 3 months later, Saladin entered Jerusalem. But without Montgisard, Jerusalem would have fallen in 1177. Baldwin's victory bought 10 years. 10 years of life for thousands. 10 years of pilgrimage, trade, scholarship. A decade that wouldn't have existed if 540 knights hadn't charged. The tactical legacy endured centuries. The wedge became standard European cavalry doctrine. The forced march principle, sacrifice comfort for surprise, was adopted by commanders from Napoleon to Patton. These lessons appear in military academies today, often without students knowing they're studying a battle fought by a teenage leper 847 years ago. But Montgisard's real legacy is human. Baldwin proved circumstances don't define capability. A dying boy with rotting flesh led 540 exhausted knights against 8,000 warriors and won through preparation, decisive action, and refusing to accept impossible meant inevitable. The numbers still defy belief. 540 knights destroyed 8,000 soldiers and shattered a 26,000-man invasion. 8,000, 10,000 Muslims dead versus 180 crusaders killed. 50-to-1 kill ratio when 2-to-1 was decisive. Baldwin did it anyway. And 847 years later, we're still asking how. Because Montgisard wasn't just a battle. It was proof that courage and leadership overcome mathematics, that a dying boy can defeat an empire, that 540 men who refused to quit accomplish what 26,000 assume is inevitable. Baldwin died 8 years after Montgisard, blind and silent. But on November 25th, 1177, he was immortal. History remembers. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest army. It's the one already dying with nothing left to lose except honor. That enemy will burn the world down before surrendering. And empires learn too late you can't defeat someone who's decided he's willing to die.